is an evaluation tool
Okay.
that Matt and Trudy came up with. Matt and Trudy are the ones that are helping me with training right now. Both of them were former outreach workers,
Yep.
have been associated with Streetworks in the past, and were willing to do work as quote-unquote contracted consultants. But they basically are coming in and they're each doing like 8 hours a week training the new outreach workers.
Okay.
So they came up with a set of training topics
Yep.
right there, and then they also have the green bag training evaluation. So this would be given to the outreach workers to kind of figure out what they've learned and what they thought of the training and stuff like that.
Okay.
And then, of course, we've got the two training documents here. You've got,
Yep.
this one is phase 1, and this one doesn't have like phase 2 on it, but that's your phase 2.
Okay. So, I'm getting confused. Okay, nope, I didn't get them confused. They're all right here, and here's phase 1. So this is phase 2.
Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about worksheets, this would be
Yeah.
the thing that the outreach worker has as part of their shift, right?
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about?
I thought, yes, and the training pieces
Right.
associated with that.
Okay.
Right? So, so I go on my first shift. I get this people. Okay, so this is what I was asking about, like the bridge is this phase 2 piece, but this phase 1, right? So it says Hope Street Harbor Lights. Compare the two shelters, right?
Mhm.
So if I'm not in the Twin Cities and I'm someplace else,
Gotcha.
I need to compare two shelters.
Right.
So why these
And you may
two?
actually be in a community where they don't even have a shelter.
Right. So what am I? So what? So between these two, what am I? What's my purpose for taking two?
All right. Of course, I'm going to use the whiteboard. right?
Yep.
All right. All right. So the point of sending them to Harbor Lights and Hope Street and asking them to compare the two.
Yep.
There's a couple things that go into that. All right. So Hope Street is a youth shelter. Harbor Lights is an adult shelter that youth may use. Have you been to either one of these
No, I
sites?
haven't.
All right. So let me give you the
So hold on just for a second.
Yeah.
So compare two shelters, an
Mm-hmm.
adult shelter and a youth shelter. Is that fair?
Yep.
Okay.
Now, if you're talking about a community that doesn't have a shelter or
Oh,
only has
yeah.
like one,
So what?
then maybe we need to identify a youth-specific service and a non-youth specific service. So
Okay.
let's say I'm working in Indianapolis where they don't have a youth shelter, but they have maybe, say, a youth drop-in center. You would want to compare a youth drop-in center with an adult drop-in center.
Thank you. That's
All right, so you've got youth, you've got South Minneapolis.
okay. So comparing those two.
Adults downtown.
All right.
All right. Now, when we have them do these site visits, I also tell them that they shouldn't call ahead. You know, the natural instinct when you're doing a site visit to call ahead, make an appointment so you can talk to someone who can give you a tour.
Right.
That's not the point of these site visits. The point of these site visits are to walk in and try to experience them in many of the same ways that the youth would experience them. Now, as a professional, you're not going to. There will always be a little bit of a difference. People very often are going to be able to identify that you are a professional and will treat you differently. However, if you don't call ahead, you're more likely to encounter some of the things that I want an outreach worker to encounter as part of their training. Okay? So don't call ahead is a big thing.
So these happen to be, so you put locations on these because they happen to be different locations.
And also because they provide services in very different ways.
Right.
So a couple of the differences that I look for. Now, when the outreach workers come back and talk about their experiences, they don't always know what it is that they're supposed to be looking for. I ask them to compare the sites, to compare the clientele, to compare like eligibility and things like that. I want them to go in and kind of like ask questions and make observations. And then once they sit down for the classroom experience, I try to tease several things out. first things that I try to tease out is the environment. Okay, so where is important? The fact that Hope Street Shelter is in South Minneapolis, it's not downtown, it's in a safer neighborhood. Harbor Lights, I actually tell the outreach workers, do not go there alone. All right, go before 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock if it's summertime, and make sure you have someone with you, because this is actually a pretty dangerous area. Harbor Lights has a pretty rough crowd. It's very dense, you know. You've got like hundreds of people staying in that shelter, and you've got everybody from, this is your first night homeless and you're 18 years old, to the 60-year-old who's been homeless for 40 years. You've got people experiencing schizophrenia, all kinds of mental health issues, and dual diagnosis like addiction issues as well. All right, and then in addition to those people that are actually using Harbor Lights in terms of their shelter services, then you have all those people that hang around those people right there. So the clients themselves range in terms of like vulnerability and that kind of thing, but it's not just those people that are in that shelter that could potentially be a problem. It's also the fact that there's people that hang around Harbor Lights because they can sell drugs, they can sell stuff, they can harass people. If you're a pimp, this is where you go to recruit. All right, these are very fertile. Now this is a good place to go to recruit as well, but this, you know, I mean, you just stand on the corner and wait for the scared kid to walk down the street. Okay, so Harbor Lights and those differences in those environments are obvious. All right, and so now that gives us a perfect kind of like example for people to use to make those kind of comparisons. In another community, the person who's doing the training would have to be more deliberate and have to identify it. All right, I want a youth-specific service and I want a non-youth specific service, so I can compare those two.
So why do you say non-youth as opposed to adult?
Because youth are adults. If you're talking about, 13 to 24, you're talking about adults.
Okay.
So I think that's an important distinction to make. Plus, it's very important to the clients.
Yep.
So it's important to start talking in those terms right away in training, because youth will pick up on it. If you're referring to, if they say, okay, this is a youth service and this is an adult service, a youth's going to pick up on that. Oh, I'm not an adult. That kind
So
of thing.
youth and non-youth.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of the differences that you see are environment. You see density. Whoa! Wow. They had been doing the carpet in here this morning, and I guess they forgot to lock the doors.
Wow.
Yeah.
That wind is no joke. Yeah, we're okay. We're good. We're good.
The carpet people had moved all the furniture outside, but they hadn't latched the door, so when they moved the furniture back on, they didn't latch the door, and the thing just flew open. I know.
Whoa.
So a couple of the differences that you're going to see, you see that environment right away.
Right.
And these aren't going to be the same for every place, but these are some of the things that you can start talking about. Because very often, youth services, they usually put them in different places than they do adult services. Okay? So the environment, you're talking location, nicer neighborhood, safer. This is like downtown, this is behind the Target Center. It's right next to a pawn shop. In terms of density, you're talking 400 people in a shelter. In terms of like a youth shelter, you're talking 28 youth staying in shelter. So the density is very different. One of the things that that they do is I'll ask an outreach worker to give me directions if I was a youth. And so I'm going to be listening for that outreach worker who actually knows how to kind of like give directions to a youth. If all of a sudden the outreach worker is giving you driving directions, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking to see, is the outreach worker know the bus lines and stuff like that? you know? And some of them do. Some of them regularly ride the bus or know that as part of their job. And some of them have never even set foot on a bus and can't even describe how that system works.
So environment, density, what we say transportation, because
Well-
if I'm in a community that doesn't have a bus, like like Anoka County, they don't have regular bus services to some of these places.
Right.
So
So if you were asking about Hope for Youth, for example, in
Yep.
Anoka County,
Yep.
you know, they do have bus services. They're very limited.
Yep.
And I would want, if I'm going to be asking an outreach worker, so there are parts of this that are compare and contrast,
Right.
and there are parts of it that are just like, I'm just finding out what you know. So what you know that isn't part of that compare and contrast is transportation. Do you talk bus? Because if I'm talking to an outreach worker and their assignment was to visit Hope for Youth, and they came back from their visit from Hope for Youth and got this wonderful tour, and I sit there and say, so how would a youth get there? How would the youth get there from downtown Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul? How would the youth get there from, say, Washington County?
Yep.
You know? And if the outreach worker can't answer that question or starts giving me street directions, I'm going to sit there and go, well, you're working with youth that don't have that don't have a car, that can't get a ride. The best they might have is a bus token. How do they get out to these places? You know? And right away, if I've got an outreach worker that can't answer a question like that, then that becomes one of those things that they need to work on. You know, you can already start to say, okay, you need to learn your bus routes, all right? When you're visiting a site, if you're using a resource that you plan on using as a referral to a youth, you need to think in terms of that youth, not how you use it. I don't care where the parking lot is for Hope for Youth. I don't care if it's meters or diagonal parking, that doesn't matter. What matters is how does that 16 to 23-year-old access that drop-in center? So right away, when you're doing these site visits, it's not just a simple matter of walking in and glad handing getting a tour. I really want to find out, are you looking at this in terms of how I'm going to use this resource?
Yep.
Okay? So when I'm talking to them about comparing Hope Street Shelter and Harbor Lights, right away, some of the things we're going to talk about is when you do get inside the building. First off, how easy is it to access that building? Okay? One of the reasons I give them Hope Street is because it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week shelter, but there's not always someone answering the door. All right? You would need to tell a youth that you have to show up at 5 o'clock. Okay? So access is, well, and again, that's probably less of a compare or contrast because you're doing all of this, but
But it certainly could be.
yeah, because you will compare and contrast them too. Like, but I mean, also, you can't show up to Harbor Lights and expect to get in the middle of the day. They don't open up like that. Okay? So you would need to know, well, at 5 p.m., that's when the shelter opens up. In terms of getting to bed, you have to call ahead. You use the YSN app. Over here,
You say a what? Use a what?
the YSN app.
What's the YSN?
All right. Do you have internet right now?
I don't.
Okay. Pull it up on your phone.
My phone's dead, so sorry, but
No problem. I'll show you the YSN app. This would be a good thing for you to see. All right, go ahead and play around on there. Check out shelters.
oh, Youth Service Network.
So if you page down on the shelter tab, it shows you all the shelters and it shows you whether or not there's openings or not.
Wow.
Yeah.
4 beds available at 180 degrees.
Now, the problem with that is Brittany's place is just for trafficked youth, you know? Most of the places are gonna be full.
7 beds.
2 beds
yeah.
available on Booth Brown. The
Yeah.
Bridge, again, are only minors, so they have 7 beds available.
Yep, Tubman, no beds.
And there's 1 bed available at Hope Street.
Wow.
Nice.
And this is for Minneapolis.
No, this is for the 7-county metro.
What? But they don't say how many, I mean,
How many
What-
beds total?
yeah, how many beds total?
No.
Okay.
And Hope Street has 28. Avenues has, God, they gotta be up around 35, I believe, with both their Brooklyn and their North Minneapolis.
But I'm just,
Sorry?
I'm just floored at the limited number
Of openings?
Of places in the 7 county.
Andre, I was about to tell you, our community is ridiculously good in terms of providing services. Like, there are communities like Indianapolis where there's no shelter for youth.
Wow.
There are places where you're going to have outreach workers doing outreach in places that don't even have the option of shelter. What if you were doing outreach in rural New Mexico?
Right.
You know?
It's crazy.
Right.
No, I just,
And the beds are usually filled. Like
Yeah.
that 1 bed at Hope Street, that's probably already filled.
yep,
If you were to check it in about an hour or two, it's probably going to be full.
yep. Okay.
So, in terms of access, you know, you're talking Harbor Lights, you're talking 7 p.m. There's no calling ahead. You have to go to what's called the SPO, which is a common access point for Hennepin County Shelter. You have to go down to St. Olaf's Church in downtown Minneapolis
Yep,
in the
no St.
basement.
Olaf.
You've
Yep,
heard about that?
yep.
So that's how you get into shelter in the adult side of things. Some of the other differences, you walk into Hope Street and it's kind of a cheery place, relatively speaking. Particularly, it's really funny if you visit Hope Street first, you're gonna sit there and go, wow, this is kind of institutional, a lot of, you know, cement, you know, walls and stuff like that. They do a good job of, you know, putting, you know, nice stuff on the walls to make it more kid-friendly, but still a little institutional. And then you do your site visit at Harbor Lights and you're just like, holy crap, Hope Street is awesome. Because Harbor Lights is like, you can feel it crushing your soul the moment you walk in. Okay? When I have outreach workers that come back from their Harbor Lights site visit and they give me a rosy review of Harbor Lights, I have to sit there and figure out where that's coming from. Either A, they're not telling me everything, you know, they're trying to tell me what they think they want me to hear, which is this nice kind of review of a place,
Right.
or they never actually went.
Okay.
So, but like this is basically soul crushing. Over here, they might be a little bit nicer. You know, I had one outreach worker visit a shelter. One of the reasons I tell them don't call ahead is because I'm hoping that 1 or 2 of these places that they visit is actually going to give them a brush off. Okay, and so, and I've had outreach workers do come back from their site visits and say, "Why didn't you let me call ahead? That staff is really pissed." And I'm like, "Because I want you to experience that."
So would you call that like kind of center attitude or service? What would you, because it's different than the environment and the atmosphere, but it is very much about, I don't know, what do you call that? Outside of soul crushing and, you know.
That's a good question. What would you call that?
It sounds like Hope is more like kind of a nesting spot where Harbor Lights is just like, look, this is bare bones, cut and dry. All we got is a roof for you.
Yeah.
On your own.
Yeah, you got a mat, and you're sleeping with 100
Yeah.
other people in the same room, some of
Right.
whom are going to steal your stuff the moment you go to sleep.
Right.
Yeah. And then Hope Street is different. And one of the things that we need to go into that is talking about why. It's not as simple enough to just say, Hope Street's nice, Harbor Lights is scary as hell. It's really important for outreach workers to understand why those differences.
So
are
would we
that
call
way.
that atmosphere, or
You
would
can
you
call it atmosphere. You can call it, you know, because it's about so many different things. I mean, there's so many things that go into it. I mean, youth programs are usually designed with a little bit more thinking involved.
Yeah.
I mean, part of it is the fact that there's more oversight with youth shelters. Now, there's oversight with adult shelters, but not as much. okay? The licensing are different, and in most states, if you're gonna have a youth shelter, it's gotta be staffed differently than an adult shelter.
Right.
Over here, you've got like one staff for every 100 people. Over here, you've got one staff for every 12 people. And what that does is it changes things, because, I mean, and it's not so much that Harbor Lights doesn't like being nice, they don't have
Right.
the capacity to be nice. And so what you're looking at is the capacity for services, the capacity for safety, the capacity for all those things that we think our services should be. This is the starting point for a larger conversation that should run all the way through this, because we want to approach all of our partners in the same way, all of the different resources that we use. We don't want to just say, wow, I really don't like that drop-in center, they suck, this one over here is cooler, that kind of thing. That's a very superficial kind of like read on the place. Outreach workers need to understand these services and understand why the services operate differently, so that they can then help the outreach worker navigate those resources. I mean, help the outreach worker needs to help the youth navigate those resources. All right. So if they can identify what makes those services different, then they approach those services differently. Okay.
So if I make this chart, if I took this chart and I said that this is a capacity contrast
Yeah.
chart.
Yeah, you
That
could
would be
say
fair.
that. I mean,
Okay.
and again, like again, I see this as like one of those. These are one of those lessons that has to stretch out. It's
Yeah.
not a simple thing. And the way I set it up in terms of the training is that first classroom really was that kind of setup. I want you to go out, make the observations so that you can come back and discuss it. And then the next set of your training is to then manage some of these partnerships. And so that middle conversation after they've come back from Hope Street and Harbor Lights is to try to pick their brains in terms of what they observed and stuff like that, and then have a realistic conversation about why these things are different so that you can figure out how to use them. All right? If you know that there is a higher ratio of staffing in Hope Street, then you know that you can identify a particular staff there, and that staff can help that youth. You know they're going to be like singled out like that. And so that youth that needed a little extra help is going to get it at Hope Street. At Harbor Lights, you have to worry about the fact that they could experience Harbor Lights for a month and never talk to a staff person. Okay? They're not going to get that additional help. And that's going to help you and if you can understand that kind of capacity, then you understand how to operate other resources. Okay? So when you walk into YouthLink, you're sitting there thinking, okay, I'm going to send the youth to YouthLink and tell them they can get case management there. But if you know YouthLink in the same way, you understand it's not as simple as just saying show up to YouthLink and get a case manager. They don't have the capacity to necessarily give every youth a case manager. You walk into a place like Oasis where they have much fewer youth, much larger staffing ratio, you can send them to Oasis. I was just training Autumn the other day, and Autumn did her site visits in her drop-in centers, and she actually used to work at YouthLink. She went down to Oasis, and when she was comparing and contrasting YouthLink to Oasis, she said to me, if I had a youth that needed intensive services, that needed attention, I would send them to Oasis, even if it was outside their neighborhood, because I know that if they walked into Oasis, they're going to get attention. If they walked into YouthLink, they could go to YouthLink for a month and never talk to anybody. They'd get lost. And so that right there, that's an outreach worker that's getting it, And that's kind of like the whole point of these different site visits and experiences and trying to tease that kind of thing out, is that critical thinking from an outreach worker that finally says, that's how I'm going to use that resource. There's nothing in YouthLink's brochure or Oasis's brochure that is going to tell you that, okay? Outreach workers need to learn it using critical thinking, understanding that when they walk in, they have to look at a resource is, how do I use this? How does the youth use this? And those things can tell them how to approach things. When Autumn said, I would send that youth to Oasis, boom. That's A+ work in terms of critical thinking. That's a smart move. And that's not something I told her, okay? That's something she was able to figure out based on comparing those two things. And that's what we need all outreach workers to approach their work with, is that critical thinking. I don't want them to just walk in to a drop-in center and repeat what they heard on tour. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not that I don't care about what they hear on the tour, but it's their ability to really figure out what this program actually is as opposed to what it says it is. Harbor Lights isn't going to sit there and say, we put 400 people on mats. It's kind of dangerous, you know? Don't take meds that make you sleepy here, that kind of thing. They're not going to say things like you need to find a different place to lock up your valuables. You can't bring them into the shelter. They're not going to say those things. You have to figure those out.
So environment, density, access.
Those are just a couple of things that you
Atmosphere.
compare and contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's environment, density, access. There's, like you said, atmosphere. Let's see, what else would you be comparing? Safety.
Staffing, possibly.
And when you're talking about capacity, you're talking about things like the capacity of the program, which would tell you things about the staffing, which would tell you things about access, which might tell you some of the things about safety. But when you're also talking about capacity, you're not just talking about the capacity of the program itself, but you have to talk about the capacity of the environment, which again gets back to access. Okay?
So say more about the environment.
The environment's capacity. For example, like we were talking about the transportation issue.
Yeah.
If you've got a drop-in center in Anoka County, it's not the program's problem that transportation is a problem. It's the environment's problem.
Okay.
The other thing too is, you know, that environment's capacity kind of changes how a youth might use that. I mean, is this a neighborhood that they can walk through? Is this a safe neighborhood? That kind of thing. Harbor Lights can't control the kind of like neighborhood around it, you know, but that neighborhood around it definitely affects the youth's experience in that shelter.
Okay. Like the pawn shop, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Or the fact that there's just hundreds of people, you know, you basically have to walk through a crowd of people, some of whom are, you know, kind of dangerous to get to that shelter. And it's a different situation in Hope Street. Is that because Hope Street designed their environment? No. They may have chosen their environment specifically
Because-
for that reason, but at the same time, they don't control that environment.
okay.
But it does affect how people use that shelter,
Okay.
you know?
I'm going to call that geolocation.
Cool.
So, because you're right, it is environment. But to use environment twice might be a little bit confusing for folks.
Sure,
So we'll
sure.
talk about geolocation.
And again, like when I ask outreach workers to kind of compare those different things, that's what I'm trying to get at, is that idea that to think about these service referrals as more than just you're sending them to a place. You need to think about that place you're sending them to.
Yeah.
And they could be eligible for Hope Street, you know, but recognizing the fact that, wait a second, is this in an area where they're safe to be? There was a time where there were youth that couldn't ride the 5 all the way from their own neighborhood down to Hope Street, because the 5 was a little drama-filled, you know? And if you're a youth who, you know, is wearing colors, you gotta be conscious of which neighborhood you're taking your bus through. You know what I mean? And so it's those kind of things that factor into it. I mean, there were youth where I was like, nah, I know the 5 is a shorter route, but you're gonna wanna take the bus going down Bloomington. You know? If you're not gonna take off the blue jacket, you're gonna wanna take the bus through Bloomington. You don't wanna take the 5.
Okay. So in terms of transportation, access, we also talked about the YSN app versus the SPO place. So
Right.
you're also saying, I mean, this conversation you just had about wearing the right colors is something else that someone needs to know, right?
Right.
So is that, I mean, I don't want to typecast anything like that, but is that about the, is that, so I'll say it bluntly, but then I want to massage it and make it
Yeah.
more nuanced. But is that knowing about the gang territory stuff? Is that about knowing like the social climate of these areas?
Sure.
How would you?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I mean,
Because
and in some neighborhoods you're gonna know, like kind of like where the gang territories are, and in some of them it's far more complicated than an outreach worker can be able to keep up on. And some outreach workers are much better at knowing kind of like what the territories are. It's the most important thing is being able to know how much you know and what you don't know. All right, being able to recognize the fact that like for me as a white male, I can walk through a neighborhood and that neighborhood is safe to me. Okay. But I need to recognize the fact that while I can't base my entire perception of this neighborhood on my experiences, because I can walk through a lot of neighborhoods safely because I'm a white male,
yeah,
but a female may not be able to. A young black man would not be able to walk through the same neighborhood with the same level of safety as I do, you know, and that's important to recognize too. I mean, we've had programs in neighborhoods where, you know, you'd have community meetings and they'd be talking about the safety in the neighborhood, and you know, white people in the neighborhood were talking about how the neighborhood's perfectly safe and they don't understand why people have a gripe, but black families in the neighborhood have a completely different experience. Same neighborhood, they could have been like side by side neighbors and they're going to have different experiences. That, and it's really important for an outreach worker to know that. But that's just an example, that's just one example of kind of like outreach workers kind of understanding the environments and how it factors into those referrals. I mean, in terms of access, Hope Street Shelter right now has an opening. They're probably not going to have an opening tonight. Harbor Lights, on the other hand, that youth could get into Harbor Lights tonight. You know? So all the youth shelters could, like none of the youth shelters could have openings. Harbor Lights could have plenty of room for those youth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's where that
that's
youth
the
is
best
going to
place
go.
for them. Yeah.
You know, because of all the things that goes into it. You know, I would say most youth would probably continue to couch hop and even do survival sex rather than spend a night at Harbor Lights. They'll make some pretty unsafe choices rather than going to Harbor Lights. And that's an important thing to remember too, is that, you know, very often these, you know, when we're seeing youth making these really bad choices, we sit there and go, why would they make such a
But
bad
they're
choice?
the best. They think they're the best options they have.
And very often they actually are the best options. When you hear people sitting there saying, you know, God, they just make some awful choices. It's like, nah, actually, when you're saying something like that, sometimes that's a reflection of how little you know about their experiences and their actual choices. You know, people don't realize how limited the youth shelters are. You know, they hear that we've got, you know, half a dozen youth shelters in the Twin Cities area, and they think, well, that must be enough to house all the youth in the Twin Cities.
Right.
That's simply not the case. In fact, the number of homeless youth on the street in a given night far outpaces the resources out there.
Wow.
And that's always the case. Always has been. We probably have, we easily have almost 3 times as many shelter beds as we did, say, 7-8 years ago. And they're still full. So imagine what it was like 7 or 8 years ago. And outreach workers are working in that environment of, you know, kind of understanding those kind of choices, this idea that why would I be working with a youth who's going to continue to sleep on the street or to participate in survival sex when there are shelters available? Well, let's talk about what those shelters look like. The youth shelters are full and the adult shelters are dangerous. So it becomes a very different choice.
So you just said something I thought was interesting, which is if things be. I picked up on the last part, which is it becomes a very different choice. What is the, so a choice is a result of having these options, right?
Mhm.
So the options are very limited.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding why and the relationship between limited options and best choices, because like you just said, we look at stuff and we go, well, that was a bad choice, when in fact it may have been a very good choice given their options.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, we tend to look at that kind of decision making as a choice between a good choice and a bad choice. But if what you have is a choice between a bad choice and a worse choice, yeah, you are picking a bad choice. Shacking up with this person, sleeping under that place, breaking into this place, that kind of thing. These are all bad choices. And they look bad when you pull them out of the context, when you pull them out of the environment. But if you actually look at the context, which is actually that bad choice that youth chose, which could result in assault, it could result in rape and theft and arrest, that kind of thing. Yeah, those were bad choices with really bad repercussions, and it's really easy to call that person out. Yeah, well, you know what, of course, yeah, they got arrested, but they did break into a garage to find a place to stay. I mean, that was a bad choice. Yeah, you're right, that was a bad choice. But when you consider what the other choices were, it doesn't make the choice any less bad, but it gives it the context of, yeah, this youth made a bad choice, but they made it considering the other choice was a worse choice.
Right. Okay.
And then, of course, that feeds into your harm reduction discussion.
Right.
Do you want me to take a picture of this?
Yeah, please.
Then that feeds into the harm reduction thing, because again, so you talk about harm reduction, right? And we talked about how the key to understanding harm reduction is this idea that you identify an unsafe behavior, right?
Right.
So let's say that unsafe behavior is survival sex, okay? All right, so the non-harm reduction option is get off the street and into a shelter where you have a safe bed. So shelter. Well, actually, what you'd want to do is talk safe place to sleep. And so that may mean shelter. That may mean family reunification.
Yeah.
That might mean get a job,
Get an apartment kind of thing.
get an apartment. All right? And very often,
So if we looked at this, so safe place to sleep over here would be unsafe place to sleep.
mhm,
With one of the strategies for a safe place is to go to a shelter. Strategy for an unsafe place would be survival sex.
right, could be survival sex, could be breaking into a garage. Break into a garage. Keep in mind, you could even look at Harbor Lights as one of those unsafe places,
Mm-hmm.
But, so the outreach worker, well, yeah, if you've got no safe place is the situation.
Yep, no safe place.
All right. So what are we going to do in terms of, yes, we would love to get this person a safe place to sleep. We'd love to convince them to go into a shelter. We'd love to convince them to reunify with their family. We'd love to convince them to get a job and get an apartment, right? But quite frankly, some of these might not be an option. Those youth shelters, full. Family unification, families in shelter,
Yeah.
okay? Or maybe the family's staying with another family member and they won't take the kid. Whatever.
Right. Yep.
You know, families in Albuquerque,
Yep.
right? Job, get an apartment. Yeah, we know how easy that is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about our housing market. Let's talk about the wait list for Section 8. Or youth housing for that matter,
Yep.
okay? So, yeah, these would be the natural safe choices. These would be the good choices. And in many ways, they're not even an option, even if the youth did want to choose them.
Yep.
But let's say the shelter isn't full. Let's say family is an option. Let's say the housing market isn't that bad to get a job. There could be other things that prevent that youth from making this good choice. Yeah. So the shelter has an opening. Hey, you want to go into shelter? And this person's sitting there thinking, you know what? Shelter sounds like foster care, and I've been to foster care. I'm not doing that again.
Or I got ops up in there.
You got what?
Ops, opposites.
Oh yeah.
So my set. is-
Yep.
That
yep.
set. Got
Exactly. There were youth that couldn't come down to Hope Street because of the clique they ran with.
something. Yep.
You know? So yeah, I'd love to get into a shelter, but I can't go through that neighborhood.
Yep.
You know? So it could be that the shelter isn't as safe as we think it is. You know? What if that what if you're a transgendered youth and this shelter for all the rainbow flags that hang on the walls isn't as safe for transgendered youth? You know? So they might have an opening, but it's not actually a safe place. Or they're not going to go to shelter because the last time they went to shelter, they got, assaulted. All right? Maybe they went to a shelter that wasn't a good shelter. What if that outreach worker you talked to who said, yeah, I can get you into a shelter, sent you to Harbor Lights and didn't warn you about what Harbor Lights was like? Well, I'll tell you what, the next time someone suggests you should go to a shelter,
You're
you're
not.
going to sit there and go, hell no, I've been to shelter.
Right.
And that person might even sit there and say, yeah, I know, you went to Harbor Lights. This is a youth shelter. There's an opening right now. It's completely different. Well, you know what? The last time I took advice, I ended up in
Yeah.
Harbor Lights and I didn't walk out of there with my shoes.
Right.
So I'm not going back there. All right? So there's tons of reasons why, even when the options are there, the youth may not be able to take them. Family unification, okay, the parents may actually be saying this youth has to come home. They're 16, they need to be home, I want them home. And this youth is sitting there, for whatever reason, isn't going to go back to family. Maybe there's something going on in the family that makes family unsafe. Or maybe it's the fact that this person's experiencing some mental health issues and they don't trust their family, that kind of thing. So, survival sex, break into an apartment, that kind of thing. So when we're talking harm reduction, there's reasons why we don't focus on the safest choices, all right? And so we're operating, yes, these are options that we tried to use, all right? These are in our bag. Every outreach worker knows about shelters and hopefully knows which ones have openings, Every outreach worker, if they can identify family unification being an issue, will hopefully help that youth or get that youth to a place that does family unification, If I've got a 16-year-old where family reunification is a possibility, I'm going to try to get that kid to go to the bridge. All right, because that's what they do.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but if that youth isn't willing to discuss these things, then we're operating in these areas, in what would be quote unquote bad choices when taken out of context. But really, this is one of their choices, and it's not an illogical choice. So if their choice is survival sex, what are we doing to help make it a safer choice? If this kid's going to break into someplace, what are we doing to make that experience safer? There's not a lot of ways to make breaking into a garage safer.
Right.
You also just touched on something that I wanted to use as this idea of logic,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is a logical choice, and this is not a logical choice. But given your choices, any choice you make based on the information you have and the resources you have is a logical choice, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But
In fact, if you're sitting there thinking that choice was an illogical choice, that's usually a cue that if you're making that judgment call, if you're willing to say that was an illogical choice, Well, chances are, if you're willing to say that, it's just because you don't understand all the different factors that went into making that.
Yep.
Now, don't get me wrong. There are times where youth make illogical choices.
Yeah, because
Because that's how youth
that's
make choices.
right.
You know? So sometimes you have to piece some of that stuff out. The problem is that we automatically assume that a choice that seems illogical to us actually is illogical. When the truth is, before we make a judgment like that was an illogical choice, we probably need to sit down and really look at what were the different options, what were the context of that decision making, you know? Because another person will look at this and sit there and go, oh, so you'd rather shack up with someone who is gonna, force you to have sex in order to stay on his couch rather than going into a shelter? Seriously? That seems like an illogical choice.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but that's going to be the cue to me to sit there and figure out, actually, what is it that went into that decision? Why are you staying out here? And the problem with harm reduction, the problem with outreach work is you would love to be able to sit down and get all that information. Like, hey, tell me more about that. Why do you choose this? So then maybe you can try to figure out how to help this person. But in a lot of outreach situations, you don't have that kind of relationship. You don't have that time, you don't have that trust. So what you have to do is you have to kind of assume that stuff, all right? If a youth is making an illogical choice, you got to take a step back and go, whoa, I got to hold the judgment here. If I'm sitting there thinking, this is a dumb idea, this is a dumb choice, why is this youth doing this? What that really should be is a trigger to me that I'm bringing my judgment to here, and it's not helping.
Another thing, so for survival sex. Now, this is for, folks who aren't in the trenches working with folks.
Mm-hmm.
Is the activity is the same, but how we talk about it, is there a need for that to be different between survival sex and prostitution?
Well, first off, we should
Or
use the term
trafficking.
prostitution.
Right.
Okay.
But I'm just talking about the general public doesn't have the level of.
We do need to talk about that, and we need to, and sometimes you can go into the weeds because it is a kind of complicated distinction, but it's not as hard as you might think.
Okay.
So let's talk about, there are different forms of exploitation, and what
Right.
makes survival sex different from, like, say, trafficking is when you're talking trafficking, what makes trafficking distinct is the fact that there's a third party involved.
Okay.
Okay? So, there's a third party involved, there's an exchange of goods, of something valuable, that kind of thing. Okay?
Okay.
So that's what makes that trafficking.
Yeah.
And that's why all the exploitation that we're talking about may not fall into the trafficking category. All right? The other exploitation that we talk about does make a person at risk for trafficking. So usually, very often, we talk about anti-trafficking things. Not every youth that we work with under the umbrella of anti-trafficking is necessarily themselves being trafficked. But we know that if they are participating, and by participating, I don't always mean that it's their choice to participate.
Right.
That they are in that kind of
It is an
situation.
activity that
Right. They are the victim
the
of it.
victim of.
Right. So if they're the victim of survival sex, that would be sexual exploitation. And then in terms of, let's say, I'm the youth and, you're you. If you're paying me for sex, that's not necessarily trafficking. Some people might say that it is because it's close enough.
Right.
Okay, but that's sexual exploitation. That's sexual exploitation for gain. There's probably a couple different legal terms that may fall into, but that's still not, that's kind of like in that in-between area where some people might consider that trafficking. Literally speaking, it's not, but people are going to consider that trafficking. People are also going to consider that sexual exploitation if they're being more literal about it.
Yep.
Okay? So paying for sex. So survival sex isn't necessarily trafficking, but it is sexual exploitation.
Squares, rhombuses,
Mhm.
squares, rectangles.
Exactly. And we know also that this is like one of those things that makes you at risk for trafficking.
Right. Okay. Is there another form of exploitation other than survival sex and trafficking that,
Well, I mean, there's other types of exploitation that may not be like sexual.
Yeah.
And, like there's monetary exploitation.
right. But I'm talking specifically about
About sexual
our homeless,
exploitation?
about our homeless youth, their interactions. I mean, we kind of,
I mean, there's like sexual abuse that may not fall under sexual exploitation, you
Okay.
know, but you can be sexually abused by someone.
okay.
And those are all things that these youth experience.
Right.
You know, not everybody is involved in trafficking or even in survival sex. But it's a much higher rate than we actually have numbers on because most of these people are not gonna tell you
Confess
that
up.
they've experienced it,
Right.
you know? Particularly for males, it's even, the numbers are way low for males because males aren't going to identify as having been sexually exploited. They're not going to identify it as being trafficked.
Right. Phase one. So, what I was trying to isolate is how we take this particular document that's very place focused,
Right.
and then talk about how do we use that in other places. So I think we did this first part, which is Hope Street and Harbor Lights.
Mm-hmm.
The other is, so this looks like it's an urban, these two are urban.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go to Youth Link and Hope for Youth and Sharing and Caring Hands.
Right.
Is there, when you think about those, was there some thought as to why those are all grouped together?
Yeah.
As opposed to Sabathany and then Groveland?
Okay. So, you've got YouthLink, you've got Sharing and Caring Hands, and you've got Hope for Youth. Now, here the comparisons that I'm looking for outreach workers to make, what I'm trying to tease out by having these three
Yep.
visits is, so YouthLink, lots of youth, big place. It's even got a lot of staff, but in terms of ratios, it's much smaller. All right. You walk into YouthLink and there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of drama. There's a lot of stuff going on. And again, you know, you're not going to get a whole ton of attention there. Also, where is YouthLink? Man, you can see Harbor Lights from YouthLink. Okay, it's basically in that same environment. You know, it's right next to downtown, right off Hennepin Avenue and stuff like that. So you're looking at, again, it's that staffing, it's the environment, it's the atmosphere,
Okay.
it's access. You go to Sharing and Caring Hands, and the reason why I use Sharing and Caring Hands is for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's primarily an adult-focused, a non-youth serving drop-in center. They serve families, so they do serve youth in a way, but most of the people that are going in there are not like youth-headed households by any means.
Right.
The other thing too is Sharing and Caring Hands. What I'm really hoping, have you ever been to Sharing and Caring Hands? All right, so Mary Jo, and the thing that she runs is, and you're recording this, so I'm going to be a little bit more diplomatic about it, but it operates differently, and if you've been there, you realize Mary Jo Copeland picks who she's going to help.
Right. We've talked about that before.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, not every outreach worker that walks into Sharing and Caring Hands will pick up on that, particularly because this is one of the first sites that they visit, right?
Yep.
So they don't necessarily, not all of them have the experience to necessarily pick up on those nuances of what's happening there. But a lot of outreach workers do.
Okay.
okay? And that's good. Like, they can sit there and go, wow, I saw people waiting in line, I have no idea why some people got service and some people don't. Okay? But usually they can even pick up on why.
So can we, not so can we, you know what, I'm gonna add one more thing, which is politics.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some politics in each of these places, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That play into both either internal or external politics that play into that.
Mhm.
Okay, cool.
Mhm. So then you got that, and then when you compare it to Hope for Youth, again, it's one of those same things where you're comparing, you know, YouthLink to Hope for Youth. You're talking about, okay, this is a much smaller environment. Fewer youth use Hope for Youth than use YouthLink, so they have a higher percentage of staffing. You know, they have a higher ratio of staffing, which means that youth that show up to Hope for Youth tend to get more attention than YouthLink. You know, and I may send people to Hope for Youth. I may send them to Oasis, Move Forward, and things like that. But it's that idea of there are big drop-in centers and there are small drop-in centers, and understanding that capacity. In the same way that Autumn did, where she was able to come away with that impression of, oh, this is where I would send someone who needed the attention. You know, and being able to identify that. But one of the reasons I include sharing and carrying hands is you also need to be able to identify how some of those services are provided. Like I talked about, you know, not every shelter is a safe place for a transgender youth.
Right.
They're not going to advertise that. That's something you have to figure out. Sharing and carrying hands is the same thing. If you ask Mary Jo Copeland who she serves, she'll give you a glowing review of all these people. She doesn't, you know, turn them away and stuff like that. She'll help everybody. You actually walk in there and look at it with your own eyes, and you realize you have to be a nice, well-behaved family to get services from Mary Jo Copeland.
Mm-hmm.
Sucking up helps a little bit.
Yeah,
That kind of thing.
yeah.
I want outreach workers to pick up on that. I want outreach workers to be able to identify, okay, YouthLink is really, really busy. If this youth is in an emergency situation where they need attention, I can't send them to YouthLink, all right? Unless, of course, you develop that relationship at YouthLink where you have that go-to staff over there where you can call them up and say, hey, I'm sending Andre over to you, you know? And then they'll be on the lookout for you when you walk in.
So when I look at this category, this is what I've come up with. Again, going through those capacity things that we did before, so that's a given. But in this particular piece, it looks like you're looking to contrast big and small organizations, urban versus kind of suburban,
Right.
or even, I'm going to put rural, just for
Yeah.
the future, right?
Urban,
So when we talk about capacity,
suburban.
Yep. big and
Rural.
small. You want to do youth and non-youth in this particular section?
Yeah, you could say, so clientele. Is clientele 2 L or 1?
I think it's one.
All right. So when you're talking clientele, I mean, sharing and carrying hands is going to focus on, is it youth? Is it adult? You know, that kind of thing. In terms of access, like how you can, you know, YouthLink's got complicated access. They've got morning drop-in and they've got evening drop-in. And morning drop-in is specifically for youth that are staying at Harbor Lights or in one of the shelters. And their evening drop-in is for people who aren't staying in shelters. All right, and that's something you need to figure out, because the last thing you want to do is send a youth to YouthLink at 8 o'clock in the morning when they're not even supposed to be there and they get turned away.
Right.
You know, and Hope for Youth has kind of like a less complicated access policy. But while they may serve 16 and 17-year-olds, they can't serve them in the drop-in. That's another little political thing. They had to change kind of like how minors access services at Hope for Youth, because there was a big brouhaha about adults fraternizing with minors.
Right. So, so drop-in centers versus what? drop-in centers versus shelters.
What do you mean?
So, just going back to this, looking at these capacities for the second part, we have this idea of a different kind of contrast in the first one, because the first one we're just looking at all this capacity and contrast, right?
Mhm.
So blah 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 blah. But the second group, we're talking about contrasting small versus big, urban, suburban, or rural, youth, non-youth, drop-in centers, and shelters. I was just trying to find what's the contrast in terms of looking at that kind of capacity.
Well, so, I mean, in terms of capacity in drop-in centers, you'd be talking about kind of like, again, it comes down to the same thing that keeps one shelter safer than another. It's
Right.
very often staffing ratios. That's one of those
Okay.
things that keeps it safer. You know, and that's why youth programs tend to be safer programs, because they tend to have different ratios. But even in the youth program area, which is why we contrast YouthLink with like Hope for Youth or YouthLink and Oasis, is that those are both youth drop-in centers. What makes them different? One of them is those staffing ratios, that capacity to, you know, give the youth attention, to keep a place safer, that kind of thing.
Okay. Cool.
And then, of course, some of that could actually be affected by like how these two places approach things. I mean, neither one of these programs is necessarily what I would call an unsafe program.
Right.
But it's not hard to conceive of a drop-in center that could be unsafe, even if they have high staffing ratios and they're in a good neighborhood. I mean, if that's a place where that isn't like safe for LGBT youth,
Yeah.
you know, you'd need to know that, you know. It could very easily be that this is a place where, yeah, high staffing ratios, good neighborhood, but, you know, if you're a young black man, you may not even get through the parking lot without being harassed by a local cop,
Right.
you know?
Okay, so we have this first part, we have the second part. The third is looking at Sabathany.
Yeah.
What kind of resources does this center provide? Are we asking that because Sabathany is a kind of a hub for a number of services?
Okay, so the reason I use Sabathany is because there are just so many services in
Okay.
there. And they're not youth kind of like focused. Obviously, they've got M&IC in the basement and stuff like that.
Right.
And there's a couple youth-focused programs, but the bulk of what is happening in Sabathany isn't necessarily like youth-focused services.
Right.
So I send outreach workers into Sabathany and I ask them to come back with resources, right?
Yep.
So I'm really looking for outreach workers to have wandered around that place and creatively thought about what's in this space and what can I use.
Yep.
All right? If I've got an outreach worker that comes back and doesn't even tell me about the fact that Hennepin County has, you know, services, right? They have county offices right there on the first floor. I'm thinking you probably didn't wander around that much. Okay? But I'm also going to be listening for things like, oh yeah, they've got this clothing shelf in the basement. They've got these counseling services on the third floor. There's legal help on the fifth floor. Well, there's no fourth floor, you know? I want to see, are their brains working in that way?
Okay.
Okay, because that'll tell me kind of like, do I have to push them in a certain direction? Are they really looking around for those kind of things? Are they at that point where they've started to think in terms of, because a lot of outreach workers come in and they just think about this work very kind of like literally and like very streamlined. If I'm going to hand a service off to a youth, it's going to be a youth service,
Yeah.
right? You know, and they wouldn't even think about referring a youth to Harbor Lights because it's not a youth shelter. They
Right.
wouldn't even think about using Sharing and Caring Hands because it's not on our list of collaborative partners and stuff like that. And so I plunk Sabathany right in the middle of the training because I want them to start thinking outside of the youth services box and being creative. That gets really, really important when those outreach workers are working in new communities or communities that don't have youth resources. All right, because a youth that's working with, an outreach worker that's working with a youth in Maple Grove may be hamstrung by the fact that, you know, there isn't a drop-in center nearby. you know? And so they may send the youth down to YouthLink if they think the youth needs drop-in services and stuff like that. When it might be safer, to rather than identify a youth-specific resource that might be outside of their kind of like safe area, to identify, maybe we can cobble together the help they need between these other different services. There's so many services in Sabathani, you know, South Minneapolis would be a great place to do outreach because you've just got so many things like right there.
Yeah.
But if you're out in Maple Grove, you gotta start being creative.
Yep.
You may eventually have to send this youth outside of their community to find the resources they need, but you shouldn't do that until you've exhausted what's actually there.
Would it be safe to use words like, so Sabathani is an example of kind of a community hub or community resource hub?
It's not a good example because it's
Okay.
an extreme example. I mean, how many places are you gonna find that have that kind of concentration of services?
But the idea is that every community has some place that has more than just
Or-
just youth services.
Or it might not be like one place.
Yep.
It might be several different places. The point of using Sabathani is just to kind of, it's used as a teaching tool. It's a physical place where an outreach worker can walk in, and I know if they walk through there with an open, critical, creative mind, they're going to find a building filled with resources. Okay? If you're walking in there with a closed mind, not being creative and not being critical, then you're going to walk out of that building going, I didn't see any youth resources. I mean, aside from M&IC in the basement. Is that why you sent me there? And I want to have those conversations because I want to know how critical you're thinking, how creative you're thinking.
Yeah.
So I can figure out, do I need to steer you a little bit more? Do I need to push you in that direction? Do we need to have a conversation? Because that Sabathani conversation is that either you're telling me about all the resources in Sabathani, or I'm sending you back there and telling you that building is filled with resources.
Right.
You're not ready to be working out in the community if you can't come back with a list of resources from Sabathani.
So then, when we look at this Groveland food shelf, is this all about kind of sustenance
No.
retrieval? What-
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Okay, so Groveland is on there. Food shelves are far more important resources than what they look like on the surface, particularly youth food shelves. Okay? Now, adult food shelves, when you access adult food shelves, every food shelf has kind of its geographic kind of location. And so if you want to access Groveland food shelf during its regular food shelf times as an adult, okay, you have to go in with proof of residency in that neighborhood,
Right.
okay? So they're gonna need to see like a bill or a piece of mail with your name on it and stuff like that, which means you need to have an ID to prove who you are and things like that. Youth
And
food
an
shelves don't
address.
have those barriers. Exactly, an address. So obviously, when you're homeless, food shelves can be kind of tough to access. I mean,
Right.
some people can get an address on something when they're staying at a shelter and stuff like that. But for youth, it's very low barriers, and that's the whole point of it. All right. Now, the food shelf is great because, so it's very kind of like literal use is obviously exactly what it says. You walk in and you get a bag of food. Okay? And as a youth, that's important.
Yep.
All right? So, and all the different ways you can use the bag of food. You can eat it.
Yep.
It can become a commodity that you can trade.
Yep.
And I'm not even going to attempt to spell commodity.
Nope,
You know
that's
what I mean?
good.
You know, so it can become a commodity that you can trade, you know. Those friends that you've been couch hopping with that say you have to be out at the end of the week. Well, maybe you don't have to go into shelter. Maybe if you walked in there with a bag of food, you could say, hey, I know you said you wanted me to leave, but I just want to say that there's ways I can do my part around here. Do you think I can get an extra couple of days or an extra week if I bring in a couple of bags of groceries? You know, that kind of thing. So it can be used as a commodity.
Yeah.
Right? The other thing too is most food shelves hire the youth, so they can actually make money working at it. Okay?
Okay.
All right, so that's kind of like the very kind of like superficial use of a food shelf. The other thing about a youth food shelf, particularly when it's done right, is that it can be a safe place. Okay? So even if that youth shows up to that food shelf, they don't even, they can access that food shelf without even asking for food. They can just go there and it's safe. It's youth because it's the youth food shelf, you know, that kind of thing. It can be a place where they can just hang out, that kind of thing. And in a very unsafe environment that these youth live in,
Yep.
2-3 hours of a safe place is not something to be scoffed at. Okay? But then the other really useful thing about food shelves is they're staffed by outreach workers. Okay? Now, if I'm talking to a youth that is, I'll use the term resource resistant for whatever reason, okay? A youth that doesn't want to access. I'm not homeless, get the fuck away from me, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know? If I'm working with a youth that's been burned by a resource or two and has decided they're done with that kind of thing. Oh yeah, I went to a shelter, I'm not going back to a shelter. Well, why don't you stop by Youth Think? I'm not interested in that whole thing, you know, that kind of thing. A food shelf can be a good way to introduce a youth to services, reintroduce a youth to services, have that youth connect with a safe person. Because food shelves are so low barriers, I kind of use food shelves and I coach outreach workers to use food shelves, not just as food shelves, but as almost kind of like low barrier drop-in centers. And drop-in centers are naturally low barrier to begin with, but they still have things like, well, if you're gonna be at the drop-in center, we have to have you do an intake the first time you come there. We gotta get at least a little bit of information. With a food shelf, the most you're gonna need is your name and a couple demographic things, and that's only if you're getting the food. If you're just hanging out there, most food shelves won't even require that of you. All right? So that's an even lower barrier, safe place. And it's staffed by outreach workers who are professionals. They're knowledgeable, not just about the food shelf or the agency they work for, but outreach workers are knowledgeable about all kinds of services throughout the region. And so, and that outreach worker isn't going to press you there. They're not going to try to work on a case plan with you. If you're just sitting on the couch and you're, you know, minding your own business, they'll let you mind your own business, you know? And so that way, that youth can access an outreach worker without it necessarily needing to be services, you know? And so that youth that was like, nah, I don't want to talk to an outreach worker. I don't want to do a case plan. I don't want to do an intake. I don't want to be involved in any of that bullshit. You can say, okay, I got a place for you. If you ever need a safe place on Tuesday or Thursday night, stop in Groveland between 4 and 7. All right? They're not going to hassle you. They're not even going to ask you that many questions. They're not even going to ask you for your name unless you're getting a bag of food. But it's a safe place. And that youth goes there, and they get exactly that kind of treatment, and they go there again the next Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually they're talking to Jen Dean, or they're talking to Alan, or they're talking to one of the outreach workers, and then all of a sudden they're back into getting services, you know?
Cool.
So food shelves are an important thing. So right away, again, as part of that phase one of their site visits is that food shelf. And again, I asked them to kind of like describe the experience. Tell me what's going on there. How did the staff, how did the outreach workers act? How did the youth act? What did you see there? And they see all kinds of things. And they give me that first superficial read, and then you try to tease out the other things that are happening there. Tell me about how the youth interacted with the staff there. Tell me about what it was like for a youth to access services there. You know, and then steer them towards that kind of recognition that, yeah, it's a food shelf, you can get a bag of food. But then that next level, which is it's a safe place. And then that next level about it's a very kind of like low barrier kind of like drop-in. And so when we're talking like my kind of, my worksheets and stuff like that are very, you know, geographically specific. I mean, you can't hand that worksheet off to someone who's training an outreach worker in Albuquerque, right?
You will after this.
Right, and so like I wonder how we're going to do that.
No,
and it's not necessarily going to be about, okay, so identify a youth shelter in your neighborhood and an adult shelter in your neighborhood.
Right.
Well, if you've got those two things, fantastic, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't, let's get to what we're really trying to get at. Okay? What is the point of all these site visits? Because if you were living in a community that didn't have those kind of things like right at the ready for you to be able to make it a part of your training, we need to be able to tell the trainer what does need to be on those worksheets.
Yeah.
You know, what is the point of the site visits? And
Yeah.
the site visits are, number one, you are, you know, the site visits itself. So you've got the very literal kind of know that specific resource. Now that's the very superficial part of that assignment, right? What are some of the other things you're trying to get out of these site visits? All right? You're trying to get critical. You want outreach workers to question the advertising. All right? So if a shelter says it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week shelter, is that what it actually looks like? When a shelter says it's safe for LGBT youth, is that actually true? If a shelter says it's safe, is that actually true? Because there's going to be degrees of that. It's not like it's true or false. It's like, there's caveats. It's like, yeah, I mean, it's safer than being on the street, but, you know, you still have to have a roommate that you don't know and don't trust. You know, that kind of thing. Yes, Harbor Lights is a shelter. It gets you off the street, but it also means you're probably not going home with your shoes.
Right.
You know, if you've got meds that make you drowsy at night, it's not safe for you. So part of that is that critical thing, and that's why you have compare and contrast. So the idea would be that the trainer would have to identify two things that superficially are either the same or similar. But the point of this exercise is to compare and contrast them so that you can see what are the differences. You know? Is that me?
Yeah. That's like, my battery is restored.
Do you need to charge yours up?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good.
So that's that whole point, is you're trying to, number one, spur the critical thinking. You're trying to get a read on what kind of level of critical thinking you're getting from your outreach worker. So when you're choosing sites from your community, that's what you're trying to do. So it's on the trainer to really identify what are two things in our community that I would compare and contrast. For example, I might think, it's been helpful for me to think about Pearl, Minnesota. Have you ever been to Pearl, Minnesota?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Small town, Tuffy's dog food. It's got several factories there, but it's still a pretty small town. It's out in rural Minnesota, about an hour east of Detroit Lakes.
Okay.
Okay? So I think about that. They don't have a shelter. They don't have a drop-in center for youth. And so I sit there and think, if I were to start outreach program in Pearl, what am I going to put on my worksheets?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I would need to know that community, and I would need to compare and contrast two kind of like similar services, right? So I'm going to look at the community centers that they have in Pearl, you know, or I'm going to look at, maybe there's two different county offices and stuff like that, or maybe there's like maybe there's two different schools in the town, comparing and contrasting those two, you know. And so I would be looking to, I would need to identify those two different services, okay? And then I would need to be prepared for, okay, how are these things different? So that when my outreach worker goes out and then comes back and says, this is what I saw, you know, I can start, you know, well, did you notice these two things? That kind of thing. So you want that critical thinking component. And again, critical thinking is that idea of comparing and contrasting two things. It's also looking directly at what you're looking at and Does what's actually happening at this agency match what they say?
What they say.
And as an outreach worker or as a trainer, is my outreach worker using critical thinking and able to identify when an agency doesn't exactly operate as advertised? Because that happens with every agency. Every service is going to say this is how we operate, and then they do it differently. So as a trainer, I'm going to want to identify places where I know that to be true, where an agency says we do this, but we actually do this, all right? And then send the outreach worker over there as a site visit and see if they can pick up on that,
Okay.
all right? So critical thinking is a big part of these site visits and the training. Another thing is creativity. All right, that idea of, okay, if I'm thinking Perham, what are some of my safe places? All right, now they've got a food shelf there, but one of the other places that's safe for a youth is a laundromat. And I know that sounds silly, but again, we go back to, in a dangerous world, those safe spaces are not to be taken for granted.
Right.
So what makes that laundromat safe? It's got cameras, it's open and warm for, 20 hours a day.
Yep.
There's no staff there, so there's no one to kick you out, Every once in a while, someone might come through and kick you out, but it's not staffed 24 hours, but it does have
Right.
cameras. So in a way, it's safe because it's not staffed, but it does have security of a sort. I mean, it's still not perfectly safe. You gotta still be careful. But it is a safe place. It's a safe, warm place that you might be able to get an hour or two of a nap in.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So if I'm working in Perham and I'm a trainer, I'm gonna be sitting there, can my outreach worker identify places like that? All right? Are they able to sit there and go, actually, this coffee shop's a good coffee shop. I know the owner there, and they don't kick youth out for not buying a coffee. They'll just let them sit there, as long as they're not making a ruckus or anything like that. And realizing that that's more than just a coffee house. That's a safe space, that kind of thing. So it's a bit hard actually to necessarily say this is what you need to have in your training materials. It's actually on the trainer to be a little creative themselves and say, okay, these are good site visits because they're teaching places. But the question is, what are you trying to teach? And again, know that specific resource. You're trying to teach them this is where the shelter is, that kind of thing. But you're also trying to teach that critical thinking. You're trying to teach that creativity. How can I make use of this resource? That kind of thing.
Cool. What else is so we have critical thinking, creativity. I need one more. Is it under, there's probably a need to be a C. Capacity, understanding the, is that the point of this
Let me
stuff?
think, hold on. What would be a third thing?
No.
Now you're testing my creativity.
Yeah, no, I don't need a thing, but.
Well, I'm trying to think if there's any. The first thing could be that. The first thing could be the very literal, what is the resource that's being provided here?
Okay.
That's number one. Number two is then get a little bit more critical.
Right.
Does this resource actually do what it says it does? Does it omit things that are part of the process?
Okay.
Is it as safe for everybody? That kind of thing.
Okay.
And why? And then creativity would be, what can I get out of this particular resource? Are there ways that maybe I can use this differently?
Okay.
A laundromat isn't a drop-in center.
No.
It's not designed to be a safe place for a homeless youth.
No.
That doesn't mean it can't be.
It can't be. Cool. Context. I got my third C.
There you go.
Context, critical thinking, and creativity.
Cool.
Cool.
How much more time do we have?
Yeah,
20 minutes, don't we?
Yeah, so I would say, just given the amount of stuff I have right now, that we're good for
Okay.
now. We have a couple of meetings coming up.
Yeah, we got Friday.
So we can,
You want me thinking about anything particular on Friday?
I don't think so. I'm just gonna, these sheets are the missing links to our overall process. And then, by then I should have some of my other, outlines done for you to look at. So we'll just kind of build off of those.
Cool.
And then start working on these worksheets. One thing that was pretty obvious in the meeting is that people aren't excited just about having a PowerPoint. So,
Yeah.
because we had talked, we're like, oh yeah, PowerPoint.
Sure.
I
I think what it is they want something on paper.
yep.
I don't particularly like that tendency.